Hey everyone, Dr. Rob Citino here from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana, actually in my beautifully appointed apartment, since many of us are working from home. I see my guest is actually sitting in a studio. And I love this phrase, here's someone who needs no introduction. And what that often means is he needs a really long introduction because he's an individual of real achievement and distinguished character. And that is correspondent Chris Wallace, the anchor of Fox News Sunday. Chris has been at Fox for many years. I want to say 15 or 16 now, but he's been all over the media landscape in the United States. I think I first saw him on TV in the 1980 Republican convention from Detroit. I'm not certain if that's true, but that could be it. He's interviewed everybody who's anybody. He's interviewed 7 US presidents, and today he's here to tell us about his book, Countdown 1945. The extraordinary story of the atomic bomb and the 116 days that changed the world. Chris, welcome so much to the museum. Good to have you here.
Well, thank you. And I will say this is my first time virtually in the museum, but it's my second time in the museum. The other time I was actually there. I don't remember exactly how many years ago, but it was 2 or 3. And I'm sure some of the New Orleans fans will know it. It was when New Orleans was playing the Redskins in a Super Bowl. I guess I can't call them the Redskins anymore.
Washington Football Club, yes.
Yes, a Super Bowl, not a Super Bowl, my gosh, in the Superdome on a Monday night football game. And it was a game, you'll remember, when Drew Brees broke the yardage record, broke Peyton Manning's yardage record. In any case, my son and I, Peter, we went down and we had a Monday to do whatever, and now we'd been through the French Quarter. We went to the World War II Museum and spent all afternoon there, went through every exhibit. We saw the Tom Hanks movie, had a great time. You should all be very proud of the museum, and anybody who's watching this who hasn't been there, go. It's absolutely worth it. The only regret I have is I hadn't started this project yet, so I wasn't sitting there studying about the lead up to Hiroshima to prepare for the book. In any case, I thought I'd just talk briefly before we have our conversation, Rob, about the book and how how it came about. I'd had the concept for the book for some period of time, and that was that I wanted to find a key moment in American history and tell it as a kind of a history thriller. I think so much of history is written, well, we all know the facts. Now, how did it happen? Why did it happen? But it's all very much written from after the fact. And I thought, the key to history is that the people participating in it don't know what's going to happen. And so my thought was find a key event and try to take people along for the ride as it is unfolding, as they have to make the big decisions, and as they have to confront the key events. But I didn't have an event. And then in February of 2019, the day that Donald Trump was going to be delivering his State of the Union address, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, invited us to her hideaway in the House for what's called a pre-buttal, a uniquely Washington event where they tell you everything that's wrong with a speech that's about to be delivered before it's actually been delivered. So in any case, we was there with about 4 or 5 of my colleagues from the other networks, and Pelosi said, this is the room where on April 12th, 1945, Harry Truman got the phone call to come to the White House right away. And she said he hung up the phone and he said, Jesus Christ and General Jackson. And I immediately knew I had my event. I didn't know how many days it was. It turns out it was 116 days from April 12th, 1945, when Truman gets that phone call, goes to the White House, and is informed, he thinks he's going there to meet with Roosevelt, is informed by Eleanor Roosevelt when he gets there that, in fact, FDR has died and he's now the new president. And 116 days later, the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. So that was basically how this all came about, and I'm happy now, Rob, to talk to you a little bit about the book and the events we portray in the book.
Well, that's fantastic, Chris. I sometimes wish we still lived in a country where Jesus Christ and General Jackson was an oath, because it's changed a great deal in the years since 1945. I have to say, kudos on the book. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Not to brag, but I've been a history professor for 32 years, so these are the books I read, and I like to think I've read every major book on this time period, and I do consider myself a student of it, and I learned a lot. And I think your decision to treat it on a day-by-day and eventually then an hour-by-hour basis as we get closer to the event, and the event being August 6th and the dropping the bomb, I think that was real smart. It keeps the reader kind of flowing along and keeps the reader interested. Page turners, a bit of a cliche nowadays, I suppose, but this book really did have me turning the pages, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think it's going to do quite well. I'm more of a judge of the intellectual content as opposed to book sales, but congratulations. It was a first-rate job all around.
Well, thank you very much. That's exactly what we wanted to do. Not a dusty historical tome, but a page turner. Get on an airplane and go on a vacation. This was all, of course, done before we got into the new reality of our life. And it's a New York Times bestseller, so people have received it well.
Well, very good, very good. Again, congratulations. Let's pick up, if you don't mind, where you left off with Truman uttering his expletive getting off the phone and uttering his famous expletive. We now have, in April of 1945, a new president of the United States. The old one has passed away suddenly and surprisingly, although anyone who looked at FDR or has seen photos of him at the Yalta conference could see this was an extremely ill, sick individual. But at any rate, he had been president for virtually as long as anyone could remember in the American context. So we now have a new guy in. How much does Truman know about the matter at hand? And the matter at hand that you and I are discussing today is the Manhattan Project. How much had Truman been briefed before he entered the White House, before he entered the Oval Office, I should say?
Well, I know you're asking it as a rhetorical question. The answer is, and I didn't know this. I mean, that one of the joys, I don't have to tell you, but for me, writing my first history book, one of the joys is you have the general idea, but now you start to research it and you find out so many things you didn't know. And oftentimes, and I've often said this as a reporter, the truth is stranger than fiction, and things come up that you never, if you were a Hollywood screenwriter, you would never dream to put in. And there were so many of those moments and so many of those facts in this book. The answer is absolutely nothing. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. He comes to the White House. He goes up to see Eleanor Roosevelt. He doesn't know. He thinks he's going to see FDR. He's ushered up in the elevator to the second floor of the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt is dressed in black. She comes out. She says, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman, who thought he was going there to speak to the president, in fact, now finds out he is the president. He says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" She says, "Harry, is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now." He is sworn in. He, like Obama, had to take the oath twice, because the first time he put he held the Bible in his left hand, he had his right hand on top of the Bible, and the Chief Justice, Harlan Stone, said, no, you got to put your hand up to take the oath. So
I'll remember that in case I ever need that information.
Yes. A second time, he says to his cabinet, "I want you all to stay on and continue the work you did with Roosevelt." And they all start to go home, and he thinks, well, that's it. And no, the Secretary of War, 77-year-old Henry Stimson, the only Republican in the Roosevelt, now Truman cabinet, who'd worked for 5 presidents, now Truman was his 6th, takes him into a room and he says, "Mr. President, I need to tell you about an immense project to develop a weapon of indescribable power." And that is literally the first inkling that Truman had about the existence of the Manhattan Project to develop the atom bomb. He'd been vice president 82 days, but really from the moment that he became vice president, really from the moment he was nominated for vice president in Chicago in July of 44, Roosevelt absolutely forgot about him. He'd only had 2 meetings in private with Roosevelt during his 3 months as vice president, and Roosevelt hadn't felt any need to tell him about the Manhattan Project during either of those meetings.
This is, I guess, this is a "so you want to be president of the United States" moment. And you're brought then, you're sat down, and one of your cabinet officials, in this case, the Secretary of War, is describing to you a $2 billion-ish, give or take, research and development program that may or may not come to fruition and may or may not work, but if it does work, it promises a war-changing effect. And so you've been president, is it what, Chris, 2 hours?
No, less than that. I think about an hour. But you have to understand, he had so much on his plate. I mean, the war in Europe wasn't over yet. The war in the Pacific was raging. You had all of the domestic situations in the country. And the most interesting thing is that Stimson says to him, there's this project, and that's all he says. He doesn't say the Manhattan Project or the atom bomb, any of that. And he says, but I want you to settle into your job, and I'll come back once you're settled in, and I'll tell you more about it. And then he leaves. And let me tell you, Truman doesn't go, well, wait, I need to know more. He has so much on his plate that he goes home and he writes later, you know, I thought I'd go home and get some sleep and then come back and face the music. And in fact, Stimson doesn't actually brief him on the Manhattan Project until 13 days later, April 25th.
I mean, if you're in April right now, my own bailiwick as a historian is the war in Europe. And the war in Europe is nowhere near over. There's massive battles being fought in Europe. The Soviets coming into Berlin from the east, the U.S. Army into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland. And so I guess it is possible, isn't it, Chris, for the Manhattan Project, the eventual atom bomb, to kind of take a back seat for a moment as all those other problems swirl around your head?
Well, there's another big issue. The bomb doesn't work yet. It hasn't been tested, so there's no decision to make at this point. The scientists are working away at it, but in fact, they don't test it until July 16th. So when you think of all the problems that are confronting this brand new, or as he was called, the accidental president, Harry Truman, what to do about the Manhattan Project and the atom bomb is very much on the back burner.
Absolutely. So you now have a president who's at least been briefed, let's say a couple of weeks in, and he at least now knows that there's something called the Manhattan Project. At the end, it's been very expensive. I keep reiterating that. I know that was always something uppermost on Truman's mind. He was a very budget conscious president. It's a very expensive project, and it's hundreds of thousands or millions of man and woman hours have been spent on it. What about the other players in this drama? Because I learned quite a bit about the other ones in reading your book as well. What role did General Leslie Groves play in the Manhattan Project? Why is he a key figure in the book?
Well, I'm going to tell you about two figures, and he's one of them, and the other one, who I'm sure you're going to get to next, is Robert Oppenheimer.
Yep, he was my next question, where this is going well.
So in 1939, let me back up just for a second. In 1939, Albert Einstein, yes, the Albert Einstein, and that's the wonderful thing about this story, too, is all these giants pop up in this story. 1939, Albert Einstein writes a letter to FDR and basically says, we believe that the technology is there to develop, to unleash an atomic chain reaction which will create a weapon and an explosive device of, indescribable and unprecedented power. And you need to get going on this because, frankly, we think that the Germans, remember, a lot of these scientists were refugees from Germany, Hitler's Nazi Reich, and they're worried because, God forbid, that Hitler should be the first power to get his hands on a nuclear device. Roosevelt doesn't do very much with it until 1941, when Winston Churchill, who's getting pushed by some of the German refugees who had settled not in the United States, but had settled in Britain, we got to get going on this. So he writes his good friend Roosevelt, Churchill does, and says, we need to make this a top priority. And in 1942, Roosevelt starts the Manhattan Project. He picks as the man to run the operation your aforementioned General Leslie Groves. And Groves was not the top ranked guy, but he was the guy you went to see. He rose up through the Army Corps of Engineers. If you had a project, if you had something you needed to build or something you needed to accomplish, you wanted Leslie Groves, who was about 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, physically and in personality, a bulldozer of a man. He just finished a little project, which was to build the Pentagon, which was the biggest office building in the world. had done it on time, under budget, and now he, in 1942, is assigned, you got to put together the Manhattan Project to try to make all this happen, to see whether or not, in fact, there is an atomic bomb that can be created. Well, he knows a lot about operations and driving deadlines and all of that. He knows nothing about nuclear physics. So he goes out, and the man he and others choose to run the Manhattan Project, or S1, as Groves calls it, is Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer is an absolutely brilliant and very colorful theoretical physicist who's out on the West Coast, teaches at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, as well as at Berkeley, up north of San Francisco. 6 feet tall, 135 pounds, yes. Just almost a cadaverous figure, but absolutely brilliant, very colorful, weaves Shakespeare and all kinds of literary references into his theoretical physics lectures, and even is fluent in 6 languages and even learns Sanskrit so he can read the Hindu devotional poem, the Bhagavad Gita, in the original Sanskrit. So he ends up, and everybody agreed that he was this enormous power, but what a lot of people didn't necessarily know or really believe was that he was any kind of an administrator. And in fact, one of his cohorts at the time says Oppenheimer couldn't manage a hamburger stand. Well, he's put in charge as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, and his job is to put together the most brilliant scientific minds in this field in the United States, actually, and Britain as well, but particularly the United States, and he puts them all together in Los Alamos. Basically, creates a community of 8,000 people in this quite deserted area in New Mexico, and that is where the work of actually developing the technology and building what they call the gadget goes on. And you have this interesting byplay back and forth between Groves on the one hand and Oppenheimer on the other, and Groves is constantly pushing and deadlines, and of course the scientists are bucking out on Oppenheimer and saying you can't do these discoveries by deadline. And there's a wonderful letter in the book from Roosevelt to Oppenheimer in 1943, where he's basically saying, I know you're having to deal with these guys who Groves dismissed as a bunch of prima donnas, the most brilliant physicists and scientists in America at the time, and Groves, who's a military pile driver, and Oppenheimer somehow had to ride herd on both and make it work.
It's an amazing confluence of personalities and events, and I've often, as you study World War II, I'm often struck by how many right personnel decisions, how many correct personnel decisions the U.S. Political and military elite came up with in the course of the war. General Marshall, Henry Stimson at war, some of the names that we're talking about right now, but maybe Oppenheimer is the most unusual one of all, that somehow the government could find use for a man quoting the Bhagavad Gita.
No, I agree with you. It's like a lot of things. It's like the founding fathers. You think, do the times summon the men, or do the men make the times happen? But I agree with you. You couldn't, either in central casting as a history writer, or in terms of actually pulling this off in real time during the war, have come up with a better combination of the brilliant, the pile-driving energy and force and determination of Groves, and the sheer brilliance, and as it turned out, totally unexpected administrative skills of Oppenheimer. And the interesting thing about Oppenheimer and life there, they had, I think, a half dozen Nobel Prize winners. So they had some gray beards and some enormously accomplished people at Los Alamos. They also had a lot of young people. We tell the story in the book about Donald Hornig and his wife Lily, who he was 24, she was 23. They both were graduates of Harvard graduate school in physics, and they both went there as well. There were a lot of young people, and in fact, Oppenheimer, one of the things that he did is he used to throw dinner parties, and they were apparently martinis and steaks. It sounds like a scene out of Mad Men, the TV series. They even had a theater company And the Hornigs were involved in that as well, putting on dramatic productions during the years they spent in the wilderness in Los Alamos.
You write very effectively in the course of the book about life on the hill. You know, as it was known, this gigantic 50,000 plus acre facility, top secret site in Los Alamos, where all this work was done. You know, we often say, well, there was top secret around it. Even if many of the ideas and many of the things they were doing got out, most people would have no idea what they meant anyway. There's a small number of cognoscenti who really understand all this. But what was it like working at, you've begun to address it a bit, what was it like working under those top secret conditions in this obscure corner of America, and kind of having a sort of a base understanding of what you're doing, but maybe not understanding the totality? What was that like for the workers?
Well, you know, the scientists, the thing that interested me is that as I started to say this, I paused, but they had a reasonably good time. I mean, they were working on something tremendously exciting. There was this sense of camaraderie. They used to, as I say, have dinner parties and go hiking in the wilderness and horseback riding and all of this stuff. I will say, though, and I suspect we'll get into this a little bit later, while generally speaking, the politicians and the military people involved in this project never had any second thoughts before, during, or after about the efficacy and the importance of, and the morality of going ahead and building and then eventually using the atomic bomb. The scientists had serious second thoughts, and in fact, there were two waves. There was a tremendous wave before the use of the bomb, where you actually had a petition signed by some of the scientists, both those inside Los Alamos and some on the outside who were aware it was going on, that went to some of the top people in the government. And then afterwards, a lot of second thoughts about the morality of this. And I think, you know, they felt it in a way the others didn't, because they were the ones creating it.
Yes, yes. Well, let's return to that subject, because I think it's crucial in any discussion of this overall topic. But before we do that, let's go to the Pacific Ocean for a moment. What's the state of the war in the Pacific at the time that the bomb is being developed? We know now that the bomb won't be anywhere near ready when Germany will surrender the signs are there in April, and then Germany will surrender in May. So still no fruition to the project. But what's the situation like in the Pacific at the time? And the reason I'm asking this is of course, there's veterans of the war in the Pacific who will tell you constantly that they thanked God for the development of the atom bomb. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of purchase on what people on the ground, U.S. military personnel, how they were viewing the situation.
Well, it was bloodier than ever. The war, in those final months of the war, the Germans surrender on May 8th. So now the only war is the war in the Pacific, and it gets bloodier than ever. I mean, just to give one example, Okinawa, the U.S. forces go to Okinawa, and they believe they're going to be able to take this island in 2 days. 78 days in, they've killed 100,000. The Americans have killed 100,000 Japanese forces. There are 20,000 still left on the island. Not a single one surrenders. They continue to fight on, or even kill themselves rather than surrender. And basically, as they are island hopping, getting closer and closer to the mainland, the war is getting worse and worse, and the Japanese resistance is more fierce. And in fact, at the time that they dropped the bomb, 3 months into Truman's term, so I guess by July, 50% of as many casualties as there had been in the previous 3 years, that 50% of that total had been added in those 3 months of the war. So, and this was, again, something I didn't know. You know, I think a lot of people who haven't thought about it a lot or read about it a lot think, well, it's either drop the bomb or don't drop the bomb. No, the choice is drop the bomb or invade Japan. And on June 18th, Truman has a meeting of his war cabinet in the White House. Secretary of War Stimson, General of the Army George Marshall, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, you know, a lot of the giants of mid-20th century America. And the vast majority of the meeting is, and this is now June, this is less than a month before they're going to test the bomb for the first time. And the projection is, June of 45, if you want to invade Japan, the war will go on probably until near the end of 1946, so another year and a half. And there will be, the projections are about between 250,000 and 500,000 American casualties and 1 million Japanese casualties. And this just tickled me. The General of the Army Marshal has a number of how many troops it's going to need to invade and capture Japan. 766,700. I have no idea how he came up with that number. But
that final 700, the final 700.
Yes, that was going to make the difference.
So you have a war going on. Contrary, I guess, to our beliefs about war, this war is not slowly stumbling to an end. It seems to be galloping forward and generating ever higher levels of violence. And I think this is important, Chris. And I just wonder if you'd like to comment on it. In just placing some context, the atomic bomb wasn't dropped out of a clear blue sky in the middle of a peaceful summer day, but rather it's part of a very horrible, bloody context, and that is the worst war that the human race has ever seen. I just wonder if your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The war had gone on, well, in Europe, it had gone on since the late 39, 40, and for the U.S., of course, Pearl Harbor. Now, particularly in terms of Pearl Harbor, that obviously an awful lot, I guess every American had terrible feelings about that, and certainly no love lost for the Japanese, in addition to which there had been tens of thousands of Americans killed in the Pacific, in addition to which American newspapers had been filled with stories about Americans taken prisoners and atrocities committed. There literally had been pictures in American newspapers of Japanese soldiers beheading American prisoners of war. And I think most importantly is the fact that if you had a loved one, and we have a case of this in the book, a young woman whose boyfriend, later fiance, later husband, has fought for years now, 3 years, better part of 3 years in Europe, and survived. You're desperately worried now that instead of being able to come home safely, your loved one is now going to be shipped from the European theater, having somehow avoided terrible injury or death, to the Pacific, where the war is raging even more fiercely. So I mean, all anybody in America wants is to end the war and to defeat the Japanese, who are seen as blood enemies of the Americans.
You know, it's this uncertainty that you referenced earlier, that of course we know how things turned out. It's great to be a historian. You're looking back, hindsight, you know everything. You have all the documents lined up for you. But for those alive at the time and tasked with making decisions or tasked with fighting these battles, of course, there's just a vast abyss that you're staring into of uncertainty. And one thing you're getting increasingly certain of is that abyss might swallow you up eventually, and that you're not going to survive this thing. I'd like to bring us to July right now, in which at least there is a moment of suddenly of awful clarity, as they say, and that's July 16th, the Trinity test. We'd been working on two separate kinds of bombs, and this tested the plutonium, the implosion variety. Tell us about July 16th out in the desert. What did you learn about that day and that event, having written this book?
Well, and this goes exactly the whole point of Countdown 1945, because it is such an enormously dramatic story. And if you treat it as how is it unfolding in the moment, with people living through the moment, not, oh, they did the Trinity test and, you know, first of all, you've got Truman, who wakes up on July 16th in Potsdam. He's now going to hold a new Big Three summit where he is replacing Roosevelt. He's in his shoes, and quite insecure, incidentally, about whether or not he can fill those shoes, meeting primarily to discuss the disposition of post-war Europe, but also how to proceed against the Japanese. So he wakes up in Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin, and quite nervous about what's going to happen. And he knows that the bomb is supposed to be tested that day. Germany is 8 hours ahead of Alamogordo, New Mexico. So he's waiting to see whether or not this bomb works, because that will completely shift the power equation. Instead of being the junior man at the table, as opposed to Churchill and Stalin, who had been fighting the war for years and had fought it with his predecessor, Roosevelt, he'll be the senior man at the table in terms of clout, because he'll have the most powerful weapon in history. So in Alamogordo, New Mexico, they're going to have the test, and as you say, it's a plutonium bomb, which they have hoisted up this 100-foot tower, and at one point, one of the cables hoisting the bomb comes loose, and the bomb is swinging back and forth, and everybody, imagine, and they finally get it up and they secure it. And the night before, because it's up on this tower, Oppenheimer decides he doesn't want to leave it alone. So he takes this fellow I mentioned before, this 24-year-old physicist named Donald Hornig, and he says, why don't you go up and be the guard, the watchman on the gadget? And it's in this wooden, I think it was three of the four sides it was covered, one side it was open, little wooden shed with a roof on top. So he goes up there, and I think one of the reasons is because he could climb up the 100-foot tower on this steel ladder, and he's up there with one swinging light bulb, and he has a book to read, and it starts a thunder and lightning storm in the desert, and this lightning is crashing, and he's sitting there not really knowing, what if the lightning should hit? And meanwhile, you know, the rain is bucketing down, and there's the whole question of what's going to happen if the lightning hits the water in the desert, and you can imagine. So in any case, they finally call him down at about 4:30 that morning, and the test is supposed to happen at 5, and the weather is just horrendous. But Groves, who is there, and this is how this whole thing plays out between Groves and Oppenheimer, Groves is saying, no, you got to meet the deadline, and Oppenheimer is a little bit concerned about whether you can do it. Meanwhile, the meteorologist says it's going to clear by 5:30. And everybody's like, are you nuts? So anyway, it does clear by 5:30. And Hornig has now come down, and he's hitting the chicken switch, so that literally if they hit the detonation button, it's not going to be dropped. It's on a 100-foot tower, and they're going to send an electrical impulse, and it's going to explode. And he's got basically the abort button. And he's a lot happier being there than he was up at the 100-foot tower in the thunderstorm next to the gadget. Meanwhile, you've got a bunch of scientists, and honestly, and this gives you the sense of the drama, nobody knows what's going to happen. And they literally, like a March Madness pool, start wagering. Edward Teller says that he thinks it's going to be equivalent to 45,000 pounds of TNT. Oppenheimer bets low. He bets that it's going to be about 3,000 pounds of TNT. Meanwhile, Enrico Fermi, I mean, I love the fact that all of these, these names, they're all there. He is doing side bets on whether or not it's going to ignite the atmosphere, and if it does, whether or not it will ignite just the atmosphere and destroy New Mexico, or whether or not it's going to destroy the whole world. I mean, literally, they had no idea what the impact would be. Finally, 5:30 comes. Hornig takes his finger off the chicken switch. They ignite the bomb. The impulse is set. And the first thing that anybody talks about is there is this blinding, now this is 5:30 in the desert, so there's really almost no light at all. This blinding light, like you're staring right at a midday sun. And then this enormous roar. And this white fireball. And I think the light could be seen 250 miles away. The roar, the sound could be felt, it could be heard about 100 miles away. This fireball, and then this mushroom cloud that explodes 40,000 feet, rises 40,000 feet into the air. And this is when famously, and again, this is one of those other anecdotes that you can't make up. Oppenheimer, quoting from the Bhagavad Gita, says, "Now I become death, destroyer of worlds." And everybody realizes that they have the first true weapon of mass destruction, and a weapon which will redefine human conflict from then till the end of time.
I first heard that story about Oppenheimer as a young boy, and it just struck me that faced with the sort of primeval power of creation and destruction, that the first thing you do is turn to some kind of scripture, turn to some kind of religious writing, because there probably are no human words to describe what a nuclear explosion looks like. Chris, like everyone in America, I'm talking to you on Wednesday. This is August 5th. But just yesterday, there was footage of a massive explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. And you've seen it. I'm sure everyone's around the world.
With a mushroom cloud, too.
And my first thought was, oh my gosh, I don't, it was obviously not large enough, but my first thought was just the shape of it. This is, hate to use the word, burned into our consciousness. That's what a nuclear weapon looks like, an enormous spherical shock wave followed by a mushroom cloud, from all the footage we've seen from the Trinity test and other tests.
You know, it's interesting, but you're exactly right. People were, there was nothing to compare it to, and everybody found their own way of dealing with it. George Kistiakowsky, a great scientist, said that he believed in the last millisecond of time, at the end of the extinction of Earth, that the last man would see that sight, that kind of nuclear explosion. So, I mean, people were writing about it and or thinking about it in the most apocalyptic, in the most biblical terms, because that was the only frame of reference that made any sense.
It's fascinating. It's to have such a brilliant physicist, but also a literary figure, a literary expert like Oppenheimer on the scene. Again, it just takes us back to that earlier discussion about the kind of personnel decisions that America made in the course of the war. If you don't mind, there's some very uncomfortable moments in this book as well, and some very difficult moments to read. Could you take us inside Hiroshima on the day of the bombing? You know, it's an unusual thing. If you were in Hiroshima and you saw a single U.S. aircraft fly overhead, there were a couple of trailing planes as well who were there to gather data about the explosion. You're looking at the Enola Gay, you don't know it, but it's a single plane in the air. You might not even go inside. I mean, it might not even trigger an air raid siren, because when America bombed you from the air, it was 100, 200, 500, 1,000 planes at a time, but literally blotting out the sun, and the roar of all those engines at the same time, literally making it difficult to think. But you know, you tell a story of a 10-year-old girl, Hideki Tamura, in this book, and I wonder if you could tell our audience something about it, because I found it an enormously compelling and enormously affecting story. Why was she even in Hiroshima that day?
Well, yes, and that again is another story that you couldn't make up. So Hideki Tamura was a 10-year-old little girl who lived in Hiroshima. Let me just back up for a second to give you a sense of how Hiroshima ended up being the place where it happened, which is that there was a target committee, there was an interim committee, there was an enormous deal of thought given to, if you're going to use the atom bomb, and by late July in Potsdam, after he knew it worked, Truman had decided to use the bomb. Where do you drop it? And the thought was, and there were about 4 or 5 cities that they were seriously considering, and Hiroshima fit all of them. You needed a place that had not been bombed before, because the whole point of this was, and Churchill said this, and Marshall said it, to deliver a shock to the Japanese. You wanted to shock the Japanese into surrendering, which is the U.S. got closer and closer and ready to invade, the Japanese were refusing to do. So you wanted a place that hadn't been bombed before, so the utter devastation of the bomb would be even more dramatic. You wanted a place that had a military installation. There were about 50,000 people in the city of 275,000 who were a military encampment. You wanted a place where the topography was right, and there were hills surrounding Hiroshima, and the scientists believed that the topography would actually accentuate the explosion and make it even more devastating. I mean, those were the thoughts that were given. All right, Hideko Tamura is a 10-year-old girl, came from a wealthy family. Her grandfather ran a rubber company in which sold some military supplies in Hiroshima. In April, her parents had sent her out of Hiroshima because a lot of the cities were being bombed. There had been a firebombing in Tokyo in which 100,000 people had been killed in a single night. So the parents of small children, if they could afford to, in these cities, were sending their children out into the countryside so that they would be spared this. So she had been sent out in April to what was supposed to be a school out in the countryside. It turned out really to be a work camp. And Hideko, although she was 10, was a very forceful girl, and she absolutely hated it. And so she smuggled, if she sent a letter through the school, they would censor it, and if she complained about the school, they'd rip it up. So she snuck into the town and sent a letter to her mother, basically saying, get me out of here. And her mother arrives on August 4th, and to rescue her, and says, look, I'm here, and we have these air raids, even though there are no actual attacks, but planes fly overhead on their way other places, and there's no sleep in Hiroshima, and we very much, why don't we stay here a while? And Hideko says to her mother, no, I want to go home. So they sleep there one night, and they go home, which means it's August 5th, which means that she's there the next morning on August 6th when the bomb drops, and her mother has gone off for civil defense work, and so Hideko is at home, in this home with a lot of relatives, but she's in a room by herself. And in fact, she's gotten up early, and she's reading a book, and suddenly there is this, again, this just blinding flash of light, and she passes out. But when she wakes up, one of the things that her mother had taught her over and over was what to do in any kind of a situation, in effect, how you save yourself. And one of them was get under a piece of furniture or get in a doorway because there's going to be, the rubble of the house is going to collapse and you could be caught in the rubble. Well, because she passed out, she did collapse in the rubble, but her aunt helped dig her out. And then her mother had said, leave as quickly as you can because there will be explosions and fires. And the only safe place to be is the Ota River, which runs through the center of Hiroshima. That's the only place you'll be free of the fire. So she gets up and she runs over to her family, and they're all basically shocked into paralysis. I mean, they just can't move. So this little 10-year-old girl gets up. She has a gash on the back of her right heel. She puts some covering up, some paper around it, and runs off by herself and into Dante's Inferno. She sees people have been vaporized, and all that's left is the shadow of where they stood against a wall. She sees people whose eyes have been sucked out by the thermal wind, and the eye fluid is running down their cheeks. But somehow she gets to the Ota River and saves herself, ends up getting reconnected with her family. The postscript to this story is she's still alive. And so we got all of this firsthand from her. And when we did a documentary for Fox Nation, I asked her, this is just before all of the COVID things happened in early March, I said, would you come to Washington? She lives in Bend, Oregon, came to the United States, married an American, has children and one grandchild. Would you come to Washington? And she said, yes, on one condition. I want to go see the Enola Gay. She wanted to go see the bomber that had dropped the bomb that had destroyed her town, her way of life, and killed her mother. And so one cold March day, we drove out to the Air and Space Annex out near Dulles, where the Enola Gay is, and we saw it, and she saw it for the first time.
It's an amazingly, as I say, a compelling story. Maybe the most famous book written on Hiroshima is not really about all this strategy at all, but it's John Hersey's book, which takes you into the city, through the eyes of 4 or 5 victims, 4 or 5 people who were on the ground, and that's a book too that everyone should read. Chris, can you see an ending to World War II in the Pacific, in which the war ends without dropping the bomb? Does that exist in as you've now become an authority on this subject, and it is, as you know, people been talking about it ever since 1945. Is there an ending to the war, an end game that does not include the atomic bomb?
Well, it seems to me there are three possibilities. One, you drop the bomb, which we did. Two is you invade Japan, which I think would have unquestionably led to even a greater bloodbath than the bomb did. Everyone agreed. As I said before, the estimates were that 500,000 American casualties and 1 million Japanese casualties. And I don't really weigh in on the morality of dropping the bomb. Everybody can decide that for themselves. But what I did come away from, as somebody who covered Ronald Reagan in the White House for 6 years and has been covering national politics for 40 years, is I think it was unrealistic for Truman or any president to make any other decision other than to drop the bomb, to use the bomb. Because, I mean, think about what would have happened. We talked about the people in Europe who would have been sent, the bloodletting, if you invaded. If at some point in 1946, America learns that Truman had a weapon that could have ended the war 6 months or a year and a half earlier and saved tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of American lives, he would have been crucified. I don't see how any president could have made that decision. Now, there's a third alternative, and that is a surrender. And some people think, in fact, Eisenhower said, don't drop the bomb, the Japanese will surrender. MacArthur said the same thing. And in fact, on August 8th, between the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and the dropping of the bomb on August 9th in Nagasaki, the Russians invaded through Manchuria. And one can argue that at some point, short of the all-out invasion, they would have invaded. The only thing that I say with regard to that is, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and the Japanese didn't surrender. Then we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, and the Japanese didn't surrender. And the military government in charge in Tokyo was absolutely still refused to surrender and wanted to fight on. And it was the Emperor Hirohito who intervened and went over the heads of the Japanese government and delivered a broadcast to the Japanese people, the first on radio, the first time that many Japanese had ever heard the voice of their emperor, and he was the one who basically surrendered. So, I understand the argument that Japan would have surrendered, but all I can say is the government, after 2 nuclear explosions and tens of thousands of people killed and 2 major Japanese metropolises annihilated, still didn't want to surrender.
Let's end this today. What a wonderful conversation. And again, I recommend everyone to pick up a copy of, I have the dust jacket here, Countdown 1945, Chris Wallace's book on 116 days at the end of the war that changed us all forever. Let's end with Harry Truman, if you don't mind, because he is the kind of man of the hour and the man of the decision. Chris, you've alluded to it. In the course of time, in the course of years and decades, a lot of people who worked on the bomb and later generations of Americans expressed anguish or regret or moral doubt about the horror that had been unleashed on the world. I'm thinking of Oppenheimer, who was quoting scripture about unleashing death on the world. FDR's chief of staff, William Leahy, that's not the way I was taught to make war on women and children, as he said in his memoirs. Now, Harry Truman was not one of those people who expressed regret. And I wonder if you could take us home by telling us a bit about Truman's ideas, Truman's thoughts, not only as he made the decision, but as in later years, as he left the White House and became a private citizen again, but was constantly asked the same question: would you have done this over again?
Yeah, I'll tell you 3 stories. One was when he was at Potsdam, and the discussions were happening about whether or not to use the bomb. And it's interesting because, again, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I think a lot of people who haven't studied it think of Truman as being famously decisive. The buck stops here. He made a decision. He never looked back. And I think that's generally true. What impressed me is that during this key point when he has to make the decision, Truman is agonizing over it. He can't sleep at night in the heat of the summer in Potsdam. He complains of terrible headaches, which he had throughout his career whenever he was under stress. And he was writing about it in his diaries. And boy, to somebody who covers current presidents, those diaries are just a treasure trove, because you get a sense of the inner conversation that what a president was really feeling, that maybe he even wasn't telling his closest advisors at the time. And he was talking about the dropping of the bomb in the most apocalyptic terms. He talked about it as this terrible weapon, over and over again, this terrible weapon, and compared it to the fire destruction prophesied in the Bible. And at one point in his diaries, when he's decided to use it, he says, I think that the flower of American youth is worth a couple of Japanese cities. So he knows a lot of people are going to die, and a lot of innocent civilians are going to die, but his concern is for those 500,000 American casualties. And as he says, the flower of American youth is worth the destruction of a couple of Japanese cities. That's story one. Story two is in October of 1945, so 3 months after Hiroshima, Oppenheimer comes to the White House and to meet for the first time with Truman in the Oval Office. And by this point, he is absolutely riven with doubts and regrets and second thoughts. And he comes into the Oval Office and he says, Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands. And Truman says, don't worry about it. I'm the one who gave the order. I'm the one who has blood on my hands. And he can't get Oppenheimer out of there quickly enough. And as soon as he does, he turns to his staff and he says, I never want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again. And then the final story is just what you say, over, and understandably, for the rest of his presidency, for the rest of his post-presidency, in an interview with his daughter, Margaret, who became a broadcaster, in his interview with Alden Whitman, who was the famous, legendary obituary writer for the New York Times, for an obit that wasn't going to be printed until 1972 when he passed away. He was asked it over and over again, and he never once expressed the slightest second thought about it. I mean, he acknowledged it was a horrible decision to have to make, that he acknowledged that there were a lot of innocent people who were killed, but the object was to win the war, the object was to save American lives, and this was the way to do it. And as he said over and over again, if I had the decision to make again, I'd make the same decision.
On that note of Truman-esque plain speaking, I'd like to thank my guest, Chris Wallace, author of, again, Countdown 1945, a new book about the last 116 days of World War II, focusing on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima here for the 75th anniversary of that event. Chris, thanks so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much, and I hope the next time I'm at the National World War II Museum, I'm there in person again.
I certainly hope that. We hope that all our friends will come down to New Orleans and visit us as soon as conditions permit. But thanks so much for today. So Rob Citino here from New Orleans, Louisiana, the senior historian at the National World War II Museum. Please stay tuned to our Facebook feed and see the wonderful programming we're bringing forward. We have author events, we have discussions, roundtables from people within the museum, and today we've been talking to Chris Wallace. So one more time, Chris, thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
All right, bye now.